Good morning.
Good morning.
Blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you. Intertestamental Period of History. Lesson number 8. And moving right along, we're studying in the Persian area of the Persian kings, or era of Persian kings. So it's the Persian Empire, and that is from 539 BC to 331 BC. And just recently we've talked about, well, we started with Cyrus, and then Darius, and then Smerdis, if you want to call him that, Pseudo-Smerdis, Ardea, some of the other names that go along. I like to call him Artaxerxes X, which I shouldn't have done that. I should have called him Artaxerxes 0, because X can be substituted for 10. But anyway, we know what we're talking about, and we'll come upon that a little bit in our discussion this morning. But after Darius, you have Artaxerxes that we looked at last week, who was in the time period of Esther and Mordecai. So today we talk about Artaxerxes I from 464 BC to 423 BC. So that's rounding out that first 100 years, or first 100 years of Persian history, Persian Empire history. The last 100 years in these kings we've been studying of biblical history. Because with Artaxerxes, he is the son of Xerxes, the grandson of Darius. He continued the Persian wars with Greece that were initiated by both his predecessors. Darius had attempted to take Greece, not real heavily, but Xerxes was really the first Persian leader who made huge attempts to conquer in Europe. Well, those were all unsuccessful in the end. And in Artaxerxes' first reign, he ended the Grecian conflict with what's called the Peace of Callias around 449 BC. But one of the most important things that he did was maintain the Persian policy of religious tolerance and autonomy. When we get into biblical history, so that part was the world history. When we get into the biblical history, Artaxerxes I was ruler of Persia during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So if we go back to those two books in the English Bibles, there we find him mentioned, and he's depicted as a great benefactor of the Jewish people. And what happens is he allows for the establishment of the Mosaic Law and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So, digging down a little bit deeper, and Artaxerxes I is all I want to talk about this morning, his time period, because it is important as that ends Old Testament biblical history. Ezra chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. If we remember from back in chapter 4, there's an Artaxerxes who is mentioned, who stops the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Let's just go back there. Chapter 4 and verse 7, I believe it is. Yeah. So, in the days of Artaxerxes, and I'm suggesting to you that that's at Artaxerxes X or Artaxerxes 0. It's pseudo-Smyrtus, in between. I had actually missed one of the leaders who was between Darius and Xerxes. I'll have to go back and look again. No, we'll just let it go for now. But anyway, in the days of this Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of his associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And yeah, it's just going to bother me till I go back and look. Easier to go back this way. There's Darius. Cambyses. So between Cambyses and Darius, you have this pseudo-Smyrtus, Ardea, Gamada. So I say several different names. And that's who I believe we're talking about here. And so, in talking about the temple, you can understand why some historians might not understand that, why they would call him Artaxerxes, because if you go to the end of from chapter 7, the end, previous to this, in chapter 4, verse 4, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. That gives you a time frame there. But you have Cyrus, you have Cambyses, and you have Darius, who's not mentioned there. Well, that's pseudo-Smyrtus, who comes in and reigns for 8 months. In the reign of Ahasuerus, who is, if you remember, Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So it's telling the story, but it's not filling in all the details. So if you're a scholar or you're studying this, you're reading it, and you're not putting in all the information coming from the outside, you're saying, well, there's Xerxes, so this person here must be the Artaxerxes, even though in doing it, it causes confusion and it doesn't make any sense. But what they're doing, what the writer here is doing, is saying, hey, there was discouragement. There was discouragement in the time of Cyrus. In the time of Cambyses, remember, he was down in Egypt. He didn't pay too much attention, but the people weren't trying to build the temple in Jerusalem, so there wasn't too much trouble. But when Cambyses dies, these rulers contact this pseudo-Smyrtus And he writes this decree, hey, you've got to stop building. We're not going to do that anymore. He's killed within that 8-month period. And Darius, and there he is, notice what it says, even until the reign of Darius. And in the reign of Darius, what are they allowed to do? Rebuild the temple. And that's where you have Haggai and Zechariah prophesying. So now what's happening, then it picks up the story with Xerxes, because what happens in the story of Xerxes' life? Well, that's Esther and Mordecai and Haman. Now when you come to the next section, it's dropping back and it's telling the story. It's picking up. And how many times in literature do you see that? A theme will run through, and well, in the meantime, back at the ranch, especially in Westerns, back at the ranch, here's what's being plotted, and it goes back in time. And that's what's happening here to bring Artaxerxes into, or this pseudo-Smyrtus into the picture, but a later editor, so to speak, or a later scholar, a later scribe who's copying this. Who is this guy? Well, if I'm going Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, it must be Artaxerxes. And instead of putting the original name in there, what does he do? He puts in Artaxerxes. Can that happen in the Bible? Yes, it does. How many times do we see different names put in? How many times do we see a later scribe will put in a manuscript a different name of a town than what it was originally called? Because they're writing in a time period later. So those things happen. Doesn't mean that it's untrue. This actually happened. It's just in man's portion of bringing the scriptures down to us, somebody tried to improve upon it, and it didn't work.
So is that why the names of the same guy changes each time? Based on maybe the language or whatever that's being written in?
Lots of times what's happening is a name will be given in like the Persian, it'll be given in the Greek, and it'll be given in the Hebrew. You might have 3 different names for the same individual, but because it's 3 different languages. And you could even go to Aramaic. Well, look in the New Testament. Simon, Peter, Cephas. What's that all about? Different ways of expressing the same person. But you get it figured out. And lots of times it's who is the writer writing to at that particular time? Is he writing to the Jewish audience that speaks Hebrew or Aramaic? Is he writing to a Greek audience? Is he writing to a Roman audience? And that can explain a lot of it. Does that help to make sense? So that's why he goes back to this, because now you're looking at things that are happening. What effect is this having on Judea and the people who had returned from exile? And this letter is written, and if you go down to verse 11, this is a copy of the letter they sent. And this is what the governors, the rulers there, To Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province beyond the river. And of course, that was Judah or Palestine, however it would be addressed at that time. And it complains about the Jews. You know, they've done this. You can't trust them. They'll build a wall. They'll have their own religion. They won't respect you. Blah, blah, blah. They'll dishonor you as the king. Therefore, we send to inform you, down in verse 14. Search the records of your fathers. You'll find in the book of the records and learn that the city is a rebellious city. Okay? Well, when they do, what do they find out? Okay. Yes, it was rebellious. Yes, it was destroyed. Yes, he orders the work to cease, but then Darius becomes king, and the work begins anew in chapter 5. And that's when Haggai and Zechariah come to prophesy. So you can see how that is so far out of date to make that Artaxerxes I. And I need to get back to Artaxerxes. And I know spend a little bit of time on that, trying to make it hopefully make sense to you. Because people will use that, skeptics will use that, say, see, the Bible's not true. Well, it is true. It's just because somebody got the names mixed up somewhere along the line. You know, the facts are true. The names have been changed to protect the guilty, you know, whatever. I don't know. Now, after this, the reign of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, in chapter 7, verse 1, Ezra the son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, on down through, son of Phinehas, Eleazar, and Aaron the chief priest. So in other words, he is a priest, and he is sent to Jerusalem, verse 7. And there went up also to Jerusalem the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king, some of the people of Israel, some of the priests and Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants. And Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. So the 7th year of the king would be about 457 BC, correct? For on the first day of the first month he began to go up from Babylonia, and on the first day of the 5th month he came to Jerusalem. For the good hand of his God was on him. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. A little plaque was given to me somewhere, I think when I graduated from one of the preaching schools, that had that on it. So verse 11, this is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. And then you have the description of that letter. So, you know, that's totally different than the Artaxerxes that's described in chapter 4. So that helps us to understand the setting of it more completely. And I need to go one more. So, for us to understand this a little bit better, Ezra chapters 1 through 6 is the historical record of rebuilding the temple. What they went through. It starts with Cyrus. It starts with them going back to Jerusalem to build the temple. They stop rebuilding the temple. Haggai and Zechariah start preaching. Ezra gives the historical account back before he's even born. Ezra chapter 7 and 8, Ezra is sent to restore the religious and civil law in Judea. Ezra chapter 7 verse 8, we just read that a moment ago. Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king, 457 BC. And Ezra chapter 9 through 11 then talks about the sin of intermarriage with pagans. It talks about some other things too, but that's really the big thing. And what was the problem there? Well, the children of Israel, the Jews who had come back from exile, were beginning to intermarry, and giving their sons and daughters to intermarry with the pagan worshipers, and they were getting involved in those religions and mixing in aspects of those religions with Judaism. So that was a huge development that Ezra was fighting against. So that's the experience that they had, Artaxerxes I and Ezra, where Artaxerxes allows for Ezra to go back and teach the law. He's a scribe, he's a priest, and he's allowed to go back and do that. Now the next person that comes on the scene is Nehemiah. And Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. The 20th year of Artaxerxes is 444 BC. Right? And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and the gates are destroyed by fire. So there's not a whole lot of people back there of the Jews, and they are not very well protected. They're physically, materially, at the mercy of the people around them. Well, a lot of the problem is because they started the work on the temple and then they quit, and they did not remain faithful to God. So, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Where'd you hear about that? Seems like he had a copy of scriptures. He was reading maybe some of the Psalms. Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the words that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. So, they are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayers of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in to fear your name, and give success to your servants today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this king. Now I was cupbearer to the king, and that's what we have here in 1. He was cupbearer to Artaxerxes I. It's in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, 444 BC. It's 13 years after Ezra has gone up to Jerusalem. And he's going to go back get my tongue untangled here. He's going to go back in an official capacity. Now, a cupbearer, yes, he's in charge of the wine, but he might be more of a butler than just a wine steward. He's somebody who's trusted by the king, but he's going to be a governor. Chapter 5 and verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year, that's 444 BC, to the 32nd year, 12 years later, that's 432 BC, of Artaxerxes king. Okay. Neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. That's in verse 13, right? No, that's all 14. Okay. So he's the governor of Judah, but he's not there. He's there because of the king, because of Artaxerxes I, but he's eating what they eat, he's living like they live, and who's he working for, essentially? For the people of Judah. He's doing God's work. He's trying to get the walls rebuilt, and he's given permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And chapter 6, there's a conspiracy against him. So he serves for 12 years as governor that first time. So you have Nehemiah as governor, and Ezra as a priest and scribe. And Nehemiah chapter 8, where you have the great passage where Nehemiah brings the people together, and Ezra sits, and the people stand, and Ezra reads the law to them. And I forget just exactly how long it takes. It might be a whole week or whatever, but he reads the law to them. They're standing from like 9 in the morning to noon or whatever, and they're getting the law read to them. So this would be, how many givings of the law? You have Moses giving the law, and then you have Deuteronomy. You have the second giving of the law, Deuteronomy. You have several times when the law is given to the people, but here, now the covenant is given to these people once again. And Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 9. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord. Do not mourn or weep." Well, if they're not to mourn or weep, what are they supposed to do? They should rejoice. The Lord is giving them a second chance. The temple's rebuilt. The walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. God's purpose is being reinstated and saying, now, people, here's your next opportunity. Make the best of it, right? Well, we all know the story. They don't, as usual. A few do. And there's a remnant all the way through for it. So in Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 17, the Feast of Booths is celebrated. And that's one of those places in Scripture where it says, hey, you know what? We haven't celebrated that since Joshua came into the Promised Land. They finally do it. And they start confessing their sins. Do you remember at what time period the Feast of Booths was celebrated? In the fall, near the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would go into the holy place, make atonement for the whole nation. That hadn't been done for centuries. They'd forgotten the covenant that God had made for them, with them.
I think if someone that had someone like Moses, or somebody that was continuing on reading the law to them all this time, would that have made a difference, or that people still went astray off?
It's what the high priest was supposed to be doing. And there are times in the history of Israel, especially you go back to those early days, the time period through the Judges. That's a period of 400 years. And you find that sometimes the judges were corrupt. And if it wasn't necessarily the priests, even the high priests were corrupt. And if it wasn't the high priest himself, his children and the priests under him were corrupt. So the people lost faith in the priests. The priests weren't doing their job to teach the people, and the Levites out scattered throughout the nation were to teach the people the law. And look how corrupt some of the Levites were. They wanted a king. Give us a king. Well, what's a king? Well, that's a ruler, right? What's a ruler?
Someone that says you obey the law.
Ruler's something you measure by. That's supposed to be your standard of measurement. How did Saul measure up? He wanted God on his side, but he wanted to do what he wanted to do. David wasn't perfect. Solomon brought in all those foreign wives with foreign religions, and then it's just downhill. How many good kings were there out of all those kings? Northern Kingdom had no good kings. Southern Kingdom, maybe 2 or 3, but even they were a mixture in a lot of ways. But the priests and the high priests, they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. Every now and then someone would step up, like an Ezra, like a Nehemiah. It was far and few between. The prophets sent to them. What did they do to the prophets? Ridiculed them, tormented them, killed them. Well, after 12 years, Nehemiah returns to service in Artaxerxes' first court. as long as Nehemiah was there, things went pretty well. But he goes back for a few years. Nehemiah chapter 13, he comes back as governor. And he's going to spend the rest of his life there in his second term. And Nehemiah 13 speaks about some of the things he does. Remember, these are places where, you know, he's slapping people around. You know, why are you letting your sons and your daughters marry? And he's chasing them and pulling their beards and stuff. It's just, you know, he's tough, trying to get them to do the right thing. Secular history records that Nehemiah was still living in Jerusalem about 412 BC. Of course, that's right about the end of Malachi's prophetic period, end of Old Testament period. But that's giving us, you know, that's trying to put in there what we kind of know. There's a lot of things that we don't know, and you go back, you read some of that history. Here's a question. We've looked through Ezra, and Ezra talks a little bit about Nehemiah. Nehemiah talks a little bit about Ezra. But Ezra doesn't talk about a lot of the things that Nehemiah talks about. So a question is raised, listen, if they're contemporary, why does Ezra not record many of the things that Nehemiah does? Again, that lets skeptics question the authenticity of the Bible. Well, here, it should be noted that in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are one unit. They're one book or one scroll. They're not to duplicate. Here's Ezra and here's Nehemiah. They just flow together. So it's not all of Ezra's history and all of Nehemiah's history. It's a flowing unit. All right. Was that disjointed enough to just confuse you completely? Remember, it's mainly about Artaxerxes I, or in that period. We understand about the rebuilding of the temple. We understand about the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. We understand about the end of Old Testament prophecy and Old Testament history. They all come to an end right there. And then next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about Darius II. And we'll move a little bit quickly. There's not so much information there. More of it pertaining to world history. And what happens with the Greeks. And as I mentioned before, you go from a Ham-Shem constant confrontation to adding Japheth into the mix. All right, question? No? All right. Thank you for your time and attention.